Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to my complete Mona guide. This has been one of my most anticipated videos forever because I basically never had Mona until about 2 weeks ago when I pulled her and started building her and testing her so that I could make this video for everyone. I don't know why she took so long for me to get. I got so many copies of other 5 stars and just never got a Mona, but I finally got her, tested her, and figured her out because she is one of the more complicated characters, so I wanted to make a comprehensive guide fully breaking down her kit and the different ways to build her because there are quite a few. Mona is a character with pretty great Hydro application through her elemental skill and burst, which also will give more damage to your entire team through its Omen effect, which I'll explain shortly, and also has just a massive scaling to make it also deal a bunch of damage. She's also a character who's key to arguably the best team in the game, which is a Ganyu freeze comp, while also having a lot of potential in Vaporize and Electrocharge teams. In this video, we're going to be covering everything you need to know about Mona, explaining how she works, and how to play and build her optimally. A lot of time and effort has went into this video, so if you liked it and if it was helpful, feel free to leave a like and sub if you're new. Also, as always, I want you guys to know that I stream most nights on Twitch, link in the description if you're interested. And with that being said, let's finally talk about Mona. The very first thing and most important thing that I want to do in this video is actually explain how Monas work, especially her burst. Her burst is pretty complicated because it does multiple things and works in a very unique way, and I know a lot of people have trouble understanding this, and most of the explanations I've seen from other people have just made me more confused, so I want to try to make this simple, and then we'll cover her other talents, builds, and all that. Basically, what you need to know about this burst is that it applies 2 things. When you use it, it'll start by applying a bubble onto enemies and an omen. The bubble is the thing that deals damage when it pops, and the omen is the buff that will give your entire team. It'll make those opponents that got hit by it take increased damage, making Mona great as a support. And obviously, in case you don't know, the bubble, when it explodes, deals an insane amount of damage, right? The scaling on this is huge, and on top of that, the omen does give you a huge damage bonus, which scales on your level and lasts for 5 seconds. Mona's burst is therefore the main part of her kit, what you're usually using Mona for, and so I want to explain right now how it works. So first of all, when you use your burst, it'll apply the bubble to enemies and the omen, as well as applying hydro to whoever it hits and lifting small enemies in the air. As you guys can see, it doesn't work on big enemies like Geovishaps, but it will lift up and sort of lock the smaller enemies until you explode the bubble. In fact, this bubble will last up to 8 seconds or until you proc it, and then when you proc it is when the damage is calculated. That means that if you want it to vaporize, you're gonna have to pop it by using pyro, applying pyro to the enemies, and then letting the bubble vaporize. The omen, which is the damage buff, the duration of it, the 5 seconds that it shows here on the talent menu, will start once the bubble is popped. So that can be important to know if you want to maximize the duration of this damage bonus, which is once again a pretty big part of her kit. In general, when you use this burst, you want to apply whatever element you're using at the start before you even use this burst. In a Vaporize team, it's important for you to use pyro at the start, then use Mona's burst, which will apply hydro, removing that initial pyro, and then allow you to vaporize your burst because it's the second part that actually does the damage. It's the second part that you want to vaporize. Since your burst applies hydro at the start, if you don't apply pyro at the start, your Mona will basically apply hydro herself, to where even if you use pyro after, it won't allow you to vaporize because the enemy already has that hydro on him, so it'll be like your pyro character vaporizing. Do keep in mind, since your elemental burst does not snapshot, meaning that you won't like keep buffs for the whole duration, if you are pairing her with Bennett, if you want her burst to be buffed by Bennett's burst, you need to pop the bubble as soon as you swap out of her, since basically when you're inside of the field on Mona, you're getting buffed by Bennett, and then as soon as you swap to Bennett, if you press E very fast, your Mona will still be buffed since Bennett buffs you for a little while. Lastly, something important that you should know is that her burst has an internal cooldown on the hydro application of about 2 to 2.5 seconds. What that means is basically if you want to vaporize it, just wait about 2 seconds before you pop the bubble that your burst applies. Because if you do it too early, you actually won't vaporize because her burst won't apply that second instance of hydro. To show you what I mean, let's say I put pyro on these enemies, I use Mona's burst, and then I pop it instantly by swapping to Bennett and pressing E. As you can see, it did 74,000, but it did not vaporize. Now I'm going to do another run where I make sure I wait this time. I'm going to wait about 2.5 seconds before I do proc the bubble, and you'll see my damage will be a lot higher. Keep in mind my Mona is on Widsith, so the buff I gained this time might be different than the one I got last time, but as you can see, I waited a bit, swapped to Bennett, popped the bubble, and this time it did vaporize. If you're running Mona for freeze, which again, Mona's amazing in a lot of different freeze teams, you typically want to apply cryo before using her burst, because that will freeze enemies and extend the omen duration. Since the omen, which is the damage buff, only starts after the bubble is popped, you can effectively freeze the enemy while the bubble's still on them, then set up, swap to your other character, your Ganyu, your Venti, whatever, so that when you pop the bubble, the damage bonus will start, and so you're not wasting any duration of the Omen buff, maximizing your team's damage. So I hope I explained all that pretty clearly. Basically, there's two parts to the burst. There's a bubble and there's a damage bonus, which is the Omen. The bubble is what deals the most damage, and you do want to make sure that if you're vaporizing it, you apply pyro both before and after. With that second part, applying pyro after, allowing you to pop the bubble and vaporize it, since you are putting pyro on the enemy, and then the bubble procs puts that hydro on the pyro, allowing you to vaporize, multiplying your Mona's damage if you do choose to use her that way. Whereas if you're freezing, you want to make sure you have cryo on it before to extend the Omen's duration. Also, a small piece of bonus information, you might not need to know this, but I do want to mention that the bubble only procs on like stagger. So when you knock back an enemy, which means some damage forms like Zhongli's pillar won't actually pop the bubble, as you guys can see, whereas some moves that don't deal damage but that stagger, that knockback, like Hu Tao's E, will actually pop the bubble. This isn't something you usually need to know, but it can come in handy for extending the duration in like a freeze team. But I don't want to dwell on this since I don't want to make this explanation too complicated, but it is a nice detail to know. And lastly, I do want to mention that this cooldown is 15 seconds and the energy cost is 60, which is like in the middle of energy costs. It's not too high, but since Mona doesn't generate too many particles, you do need typically a lot of energy recharge if you want to spam this on cooldown, but we will go into more detail in the artifact section. Now for Mona's other talents, her elemental skill is a lot more simple. It basically applies this phantom, places it on the ground that will deal constant AoE hydro damage. Basically it'll hit 4 times and then it'll explode at the end, so for 5 hits total, dealing hydro damage, right? So applying hydro, although there is obviously an internal cooldown on the hydro application, but it will apply that hydro from off field, dealing damage, and at the end when it explodes it also generates some particles, usually 3, but it can also be 4. It's random, but most of the time it will give you 3. Also, while you can just press this ability, if you do hold it, it will allow you to dash back. So if you ever want to just dash backwards, you can hold your elemental skill instead of pressing it. Something to keep in mind is that the ability does a okay amount of damage, especially the explosion, but it isn't nearly as much as something like your burst. So I'd say focus on your burst first in general, and then if you're a support, go for your skill second, and as a DPS or a taser, you can go for your normal attack after that. Also, I wanted to mention that if you do choose to play Mona like a main DPS, you're auto attacking on her, the optimal rotation is usually to do 2 normal attacks into a charge attack, so to combo them together. And do keep in mind that you can jump cancel or animation cancel that last charge attack because it does take quite a while. Now for your passive talents, Mona's actually pretty unique. 2 of her passive talents are actually concerning her dash. If you don't know by now, Mona has a very special and unique dash that will transform her into a jet of water, allowing her to apply hydro or the wet status to enemies when she reappears. And the dash can feel kind of clunky initially, especially if you're not used to it, and I still find it annoying sometimes, but you still have iframes on this ability, or invulnerability frames, to where you can still dodge stuff at the start of your dash with Mona. On top of that, her dash will also summon a mini version of her skill, a little phantom, that will also deal some hydro damage and explode at the end. For your last talent, this is a very important one. This passive will actually give Mona a bunch of hydro damage based on her energy recharge. It will convert 20% of her energy recharge into hydro damage, which is absolutely huge because Mona is a character who generally wants a lot of energy recharge. Let's say you're running her on 200%, you will gain 40% hydro damage bonus just from this passive. Now do keep in mind, this passive shouldn't bait you into building way too much energy recharge, although we'll cover that in the artifact section and how much Mona actually needs because it really depends on a lot of factors. But just so you guys know, this 20% of your ER into hydro damage won't give you as much damage as like an attack sans, but it will give you an okay amount, especially when you pair it with the Emblem of Severed Fate set, to where it can be worth stacking energy recharge, even though you lose out on a bit of damage on your Mona, so that you can spam your burst on cooldown and get that Omen buff to your entire team and just the insane amount of damage that it deals. But once again, we'll cover this in more detail in the next section. With that out of the way, I now want to talk about how to build Mona, the section that you guys are probably looking forward to the most. Mona is a character who's a bit complicated to build and has a lot of different possible builds, so I'm going to try to cover every way you can build her, my recommendations, and what's usually optimal. First of all, for her artifact sets, there's a few options, but Emblem of Severed Fate is the set that will give you the most damage. This is a set that was pretty much made for Mona because it gives you 20% energy recharge on the 2-piece, which is the equivalent of 3 to 4 substats, so that's absolutely huge. And then on top of that, the 4-piece gives you an insane amount of burst damage as well, converting 25% of your energy recharge into elemental burst damage with a maximum of 75%. Since Mona is going to be stacking a lot of energy recharge in most builds, and we'll cover that in a little, you can actually gain an insane amount of damage this way because this 4-piece does add up very fast. If you have 200% energy recharge, for example, this will give you 50% burst damage, which makes it absolutely the best set for your Mona's damage. That being said, other sets can be more beneficial to your team depending on what you're running. For example, if your team doesn't have a Noblesse Oblige user, I recommend you run it on your Mona because this will still give you 20% burst damage while also buffing your entire party member's attack by 20% for 12 seconds. The main thing I'd say though is if you're running another Noblesse user or you have someone that can, like Bennett or Diona, I would recommend running that on them and then giving your Mona emblem. However, she can be a pretty decent Noblesse user if your team doesn't have any. Also, in a freeze team, where you're pairing her with characters like Ganyu and Venti, who already deal so much damage, you're mainly using Mona to buff theirs with your Omen, and to also apply Hydro consistently from off-field. Because of that, it's oftentimes more beneficial to run something like Noblesse Oblige, or even Tenacity of the Millelith can be viable, although this set does hurt your Mona's damage a lot, but it will buff your team by giving them attack % increase every time your elemental skill hits an opponent, and so these sets can be viable, especially when you want to amplify your team's damage. While I'm not the biggest fan of Millelith on Mona, as I mentioned, it can be good in like freeze teams, especially for low investment if you are mainly using Mona as a Hydro applier and want to buff your team. To maximize her own damage though, the Emblem of Severed Fate will definitely be the best, with 2-piece Noblesse Oblige and 2-piece Heart of Depth as well, also being a pretty close second, and can be a viable option if your substats are better on this artifact set. And while Mona's mainly and primarily a support character, if you do want to use her as a DPS or an on-field auto attacker, you can consider running the 4-piece Heart of Depth on her to increase your normal and charge attack damage. And so overall, there are quite a few different builds for her. Now for the artifact stats you want for Mona, it can actually depend on how you build her, so hear me out. Generally speaking, to maximize your damage on your substats, you're looking for crit rate and crit damage, with attack % and elemental mastery being good too, and energy recharge being very important until you have enough or the exact amount that you need. Energy recharge in general is very good for someone like Mona because it can be quite difficult to spam your burst on cooldown if you don't have enough, and it also gives you some damage through the Emblem of Severed Fate set if you're running it and with your passive talent. Now regarding the exact amount of energy recharge you need, it actually depends on how you play her, and this becomes very relevant especially when you consider what you should run on your Sands, whether you should go energy recharge or a more offensive one. In general, as a support, I recommend an energy recharge Sands because it will allow you to spam your burst on cooldown very easy without needing amazing substats, and some team comps just need a lot of energy recharge. For example, when you run Mona in a freeze team, you need 200% or even more energy recharge because you're not spending a lot of time on her and you need her burst to be up on cooldown so that you can perma-freeze enemies and buff your team's damage. Because of that, having an insane amount of energy recharge in a freeze comp is a must. Now obviously as a DPS, attack % Sands will be better, but as a support, I highly recommend energy recharge, although if you are vaporizing with Mona and you're trying to just run her as a burst support and maximize her damage, I do want to point out that elemental mastery or attack % on the Sands will both increase your burst damage more than an energy recharge Sands will. So these two options are technically more damage even if you are running Emblem, and even despite your passive, attack % or elemental mastery can still give you more damage to your burst. However, energy recharge doesn't actually make you lose that much, especially if you pair it with the Emblem of Severed Fate, to where I typically recommend it. For the exact amount of energy recharge you need, once again, it very highly depends. For a vaporized team, you can need around 160 to 180, whereas a freeze comp, as I mentioned, can oftentimes need 200 or more. So because of that, here's what I recommend. Energy recharge on the Sands, for most people as a support, is what you should go for, although attack % and elemental mastery can be more damage if you already have enough energy recharge. And in case you're wondering, because this is a pretty common question for reaction characters, elemental mastery will buff your vaporized damage more than attack % typically, but attack % is more consistent since it will buff all your damage even if you're not vaporizing. And so typically I recommend picking the one that has better substats if you aren't going for an energy recharge Sands and want a more offensive one. For your other pieces, for your Goblet, you want a Hydro damage bonus typically, since it is just the most damage. Do keep in mind though that attack % with good substats can be a decent option, especially because you gain a lot of damage % from like the emblem and your passive and stuff, to where attack % can be nice, although Hydro damage is typically the way to go. For your circlet, you definitely want crit, either crit rate or crit damage, to maximize the numbers of your abilities and just how much damage you're dealing with your burst. Okay, now that the artifact section's out of the way and I kind of cleared up how you can play Mona in a few different playstyles, I just want to cover her weapon section, and this is honestly pretty straightforward. There's basically 3 categories of Mona weapons that you should be building. The first category is her burst weapons. If you want to maximize your Mona's damage overall, Skyward Atlas and a high refined Widsith are the best options, Widsith honestly giving you the most potential burst damage, with Atlas being the more consistent option, and every other 5-star catalyst is also very good if you have it. If you don't have any of those options, generally speaking, Mappa Mare, especially with refinement, can be very good because of the high base stack, the elemental mastery that it gives you, and the elemental damage that you also get from the effect. Now for the second category, Favonius Codex is absolutely amazing, especially in a freeze team or whenever you need more energy recharge on Mona, with this book being always what I recommend when you pair her with someone like Ganyu and you're quick swapping, not spending too much time on Mona, and you really need your burst to be up on cooldown. Because of how hard it can be to be able to spam your burst 100% of the time, Favonius Codex is essential in that type of team because it gives you an absolute ton of energy recharge when you level it, and the effect will also give you elemental particles, white particles, that will generate you a ton of energy. Do keep in mind that you will want enough crit rate to proc this effect though, so be sure you are building crit rate and maybe prioritizing that over crit damage on like your circlet. Lastly, while it's rarely optimal because freeze teams usually want Favonius, and to maximize your damage you usually want something like a Widsith or the other options that I mentioned earlier, I did want to specify that Thrilling Tales at low investment can be good because, once again, you can keep this weapon level 1 and it will buff whichever carry you swap into. It will buff their attack by 48% for 10 seconds, making it very good. You do, however, sacrifice a lot of your Mona's own damage, so it's not typically what I recommend for her, prioritizing usually Favonius Codex or one of the other offensive weapons that I mentioned earlier. Now, while most Mona showcases or videos about her do feature a highly constellated Mona, like C6 with a ton of crit damage, mine is actually C0 because I don't actually spend that much money on this game. Do keep in mind that while Mona does have a few good constellations that I'm going to cover, you don't really need them, especially because her main role is to apply Hydro and deal some damage, and she can do that efficiently even at C0. That being said, let's look at her constellations. So your first constellation is pretty good for reactions. Basically, when any of your party members hit an opponent affected by your Omen, so the damage buff that your burst provides, Hydro-related reactions are buffed for 8 seconds, Electrocharge gets buffed, Vaporize gets buffed, Hydro Swirl, and the frozen duration also gets extended by 15%, which is honestly pretty huge and probably the best part of this constellation, making freeze last even longer, being great for freeze teams. It's also worth mentioning, and while I can't personally test this, according to Keqing mains and Mona mains, who I'll link in the description down below, apparently this first constellation doesn't actually buff your own Mona's burst's damage, since the damage buff only happens when the opponent is affected by the Omen. So from their findings, it doesn't seem like your own burst damage will be buffed, but again, this isn't something that I personally can test. Your C2 is something that enables DPS Mona. Effectively, every time you normal attack, there's a 20% chance that you'll also do a charge attack for free. It won't consume any stamina or anything, and it'll just be another instance of damage. Very good for a DPS Mona, but pretty useless for support. C3 and 5 increase your talent levels, with obviously C3 being amazing because it buffs your burst damage. Mona's fourth constellation gives crit rate to her entire team when they attack someone affected by the Omen, so once again, after your burst, your team will just gain crit rate, which is a very nice buff to your team during that duration, especially in something like a freeze comp, because you can extend the Omen duration by like freezing the enemy, keeping the Omen on them, not popping the bubble, then swapping to your DPS, popping the bubble, and giving them more damage and crit rate. Lastly, for Mona's 6th constellation, this will increase your charge attack damage when you're inside of your sprint. So basically, you'll gain 60% increased damage to your next charge attack when you're sprinting for a maximum of 180%. But in practice, this isn't that good. It can be nice for a main DPS Mona to buff your charge attacks, but it is kind of clunky and you do have to like dash around for it to work. So it does buff your Mona, but it's not a great C6 in general. Okay, so with all that information out of the way, I'm now going to talk about Mona's team comps and give you guys some tips with them and just general synergies with Mona. Mona's a character who has quite a few teams where she can be used in. The most popular and just the strongest Mona team in general is this Ganyu freeze comp, where you're running Ganyu with Venti and Mona, constantly using all of their bursts together, allowing you to permafreeze enemies and deal insane amounts of damage. This is widely regarded to be the best team in the game when it works. So against a lot of enemies or enemies that can be frozen, it's absolutely amazing. Obviously, it doesn't shine that well in places like current floor 12-2, where there's a Magu Kenki, or against the mechanical array. But in general, for a lot of content, if you do have Ganyu and Venti and Mona, it is an amazing team, with the last slot being someone like Diona, Jean, just to give you healing and particles. Another good freeze comp you can run with Mona without needing Ganyu or Venti is actually a quick swap freeze team. Running cryo characters like Kaya and Rosaria, who have really good damage on their burst and skills, paired with Mona, who applies Hydro and also does a lot of damage, can be very good in a quick swap style, meaning you spam your skill and burst on every character, constantly swapping between them, perma-freezing enemies and dealing insane amounts of damage. The reason this is so good is, as I mentioned, Rosaria and Kaya are both very strong, but they also have access to this Blizzard Strayer set, which will give them an insane amount of crit rate, and your Mona will be buffing them through her Omen and whatever set you're running. And the last character in this team is actually pretty flexible. I tend to recommend an Anemo character to run Verdescent Venerer, and someone like Kazuha not only groups enemies and can be very good with Mona in a quick swap style, so not just for this team, because of the Verdescent Venerer set being amazing, and obviously the elemental damage buff that he gives your entire team. So Kazuha is obviously amazing in this freeze comp, but you can replace him with Sucrose or a healer if you want one like Jean or Sayu, or even someone like Bennett if you don't want an emo and maybe don't have a good character. In fact, speaking of Bennett, Bennett's a character who synergizes very well with Mona and is essential for something like a Vaporize team. While this isn't really a full team comp, I just kind of have characters that work here. Basically, the reason why Mona and Bennett are so good is because, well, one, Bennett's just an amazing unit. You guys know this by now. He gives you a ton of attack and is your healer. But with Mona especially, what he can do is apply Pyro both before and after your burst. This allows you to consistently vaporize your burst on top of buffing your Mona as long as she stays inside of the field until the very last second, where you swap into Bennett, press E, pop the bubble, and you will effectively have buffed your Mona and allow her to vaporize. As you guys saw like through the intro clip and all that, I am pairing Mona with Bennett for massive vaporize damage. Mona also works with pyro carries for this sort of, once again, vaporize. You can run her in a Shangling team instead of someone like Child if you don't have them. And basically adding this Shangling here will allow your Mona to constantly apply hydro from on field. As you guys can see, your Mona can actually allow your Shangling to vaporize a lot. You can even roll around inside of your dash. And while I still prefer Child in this team, Mona can be a great option. And you can also vaporize Mona's burst since you are running so much pyro. Because your Mona can apply enough hydro to where your Shangling can reliably vaporize every hit, making your Mona the on-field auto attacker or enabler, I guess, to your Shangling. And obviously, even if your Mona's main DPS, you can just reverse it. And obviously, just in general, Shangling can be a good pair if you are trying to vaporize your Mona. Mona is quite flexible to where she can also be the last slot in, pyro character teams, like with someone like Diluc. While you don't want to replace Xingqiu, because Mona's hydro application is not as good as Xingqiu and not good enough to keep up with someone like Diluc, you can run both Xingqiu and Mona, who can be a very good 4th slot in pyro teams because you can provide your team with a damage bonus through your Omen and also vaporize your own burst. So in general, she is pretty good with pyro characters and also, as I mentioned, with cryo characters, people like Ganyu, Ayaka, Kaya, to allow them to permafreeze through her hydro application and make for very good either sustained damage dealing teams or quick swap teams where you're constantly swapping between characters and, permafreezing or vaporizing enemies. Lastly, I do want to mention that Mona as a main DPS or as a enabler can also be used. Similarly to how I mentioned her being played with Shangling, you can use her in a taser team where she's constantly auto-attacking on field while Fischl, Beidou, and Xingqiu deal a very high amount of off-field damage. Fischl through her Oz, Beidou through her burst, and Xingqiu through his rain swords, although this last slot can be flexible. You can use other characters, but this is the one that I tend to recommend. While Mona is also going to be on-field auto-attacking, charge attacking, and giving your team damage bonus through her burst. So yeah, overall, Mona is just an amazing burst support who gives you a lot of damage with your burst if you invest into it, or it can just be a good off-field hydro applier that can also buff your team when you give her something like Noblesse, and just makes her very good in quick swap teams, freeze teams, reaction comps, especially as a hydro unit who can be very good from off field. I'm glad I finally got Mona and finally got to make a guide for her. This video actually took so long because I had to basically discover a whole new character and test everything out. So I really hope you guys enjoyed and it was helpful. If there's anything I'd like to add, it will be in a pinned comment. Huge shout out to Jeff77 for helping me with this video. So anyways, that's about it for me. I'm going to go work on maybe a new child guide and a beta one because there's a new Claymore and a new set. But anyways, with all that being said, I hope you enjoyed and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.